Carl, what have you done?
Think anyone will notice?
Mr. Carl Jackson, right?
Carl Jackson was born and raised in Los Angeles, California. After the sudden death of his mother at the age of 11, he moved between LA and Orlando, Florida, trying to find his way in life.
So I'm clearly a Carl Jackson fan.
Carl Jackson.
Carl Jackson.
Carl Jackson.
Although he was introduced to hard work, faith, and family values, as a struggling teen, he wandered down the path of least resistance, finding himself jailed twice. By the grace of God, he attended an evangelical church and found that there was a better way and accepted Jesus Christ as his Savior.
There's just no fake stuff about Carl Jackson.
Now, on the Salem Podcast Network, Carl has launched on a journey to help people of all races and backgrounds to discover facts of America's true past, as well as realize the benefits of utilizing their God-given gifts and talents, which far outweigh any benefit from a government subsidy or program.
Real dangerous out here. Let's roll, Carl.
Get going fast!
Redeemed, rehabilitated, and real entertaining. This is the Carl Jackson Podcast.
All right, welcome to the Carl Jackson Show podcast. Today on the podcast with me is Kara Frederick from the Heritage Foundation. Thank you so much for joining me today, Kara.
Of course, thanks for having me.
All right, so today we're going to be talking about big tech, and I'm excited to talk about big tech and what we can do, those of us that are in the conservative movement, to combat big tech and hopefully defeat big tech totalitarianism. And I heard that you are the woman to speak to, Kara. So I'm looking forward to this conversation because I got to tell you, I've fallen prey to this. I've been a victim of this. Literally, I've been on the same Facebook numbers despite filling in for national hosts on radio for several years now. My numbers have not grown. I was literally tweeting one day, and this is probably a couple or more years ago, where the numbers, I literally lost 3,000 followers in one day, and I was just watching the numbers just fade away right before my eyes. I couldn't believe it. And then another time I got on, I was getting ready to tweet Kara, and then 2,000 followers just wiped away. And for years, I have not moved a notch on Facebook, have not moved a notch on Twitter. Colleagues of mine on radio here, local Salem, show The American Adversaries just a couple of weeks ago. Literally, they woke up one morning, their Facebook was just gone. I mean, thousands and thousands of followers just gone overnight. So this is big tech has been extremely damaging to the right. You come from big tech. You actually, do I understand this correctly? Did you work for Facebook or Google?
I work for Facebook at Facebook headquarters in Menlo Park, California.
Man, all right. So you were in the belly of the beast. Seriously.
Exactly.
What did you pick up on? All right, you're conservative work in there. Did you see things that you were just shocked about? Did you see things that were expected, unexpected? What did you pick up when you worked for Facebook?
Yeah, so I was definitely a closeted conservative when I worked for Facebook, and this is in 2016 and 2017, and the things that I saw, they weren't really taking place on the platform that alarmed me. I think at the point in time that I was there, this was pre-Donald Trump's election, I think they went a little nuts once he got elected. I mean, I was there, I was in the building actually, when it was late at night on the East Coast, and I was still there plugging away West Coast time when I saw the announcement that Donald Trump had actually won. And, nobody else was there, but the next day, it was like a funeral in there. So
really?
You understand that, most of the workforce was very liberal, leftist, progressive, and whatnot. So I understood that, hence the reason why I was a closeted conservative. And when you were working on a team like I did, I ran the counterterrorism analysis program there. It was more getting your hands in the data. It was more looking at publicly available information and discerning trends and patterns and whatnot. And we were looking at foreign Islamic terrorism, which was a genuine problem on the platform. And I think, we were all working together, and nobody really was saying, okay, we have to target right-leaning people on my team, at least. We were very focused on ISIS and Al-Qaeda and their cheerleaders and propagandists on the platform. But I did see a strain emerging that did, in fact, make me a little concerned. It didn't alarm me at the time, but once Donald Trump was elected, I saw that we started recruiting people who had, dissertations on white supremacy, who were looking at right-leaning domestic extremists, and there was sort of a push to integrate that more so than foreign Islamic terrorism into our into what we did on a day-to-day basis in terms of counterterrorism, at least on the policy side. So those were, I think, the seeds of what sprung out eventually and became this overt anti-conservative bias, definitely perpetuated by different teams than ours, but I think given the nature of the employee base, you have to assume that it's gonna move left, it's gonna move in that direction, and I only saw tiny seeds of it there, and that really exploded after Donald Trump's election.
Okay, I watched a video of yours, and you talked about when it comes to social media, you said basically there are three things that we need to understand when it comes to social media platforms, and that is they have a bottom line that they want to achieve. It's growth at all costs. It's absolute brand and reputation for them. I want you to talk about those three things, but also, does it do us any good? I get so frustrated with this, Kara, when I see Republicans, when they had some power in Congress, these big tech CEOs, they come to Congress, they grill them for, whatever, a day or two, and nothing comes out of it. And I'm sitting there thinking, okay, what the heck? Why are Republicans so feckless at this? And then talk to us about those three things and why they are so important to big tech.
Yeah, I'll start with the fecklessness first. And as you know, Republicans, conservatives, we love our private companies. We love our businesses. So I think a lot of times, especially the libertarians in our party or near our party, they tend to say, oh, they're private businesses. Don't touch them. Leave them alone. They can do no wrong. But there's a misdiagnosis of the problem in that regard. So I don't think before, at least this past year, Republicans diagnosed the threat properly. I don't think conservatives actually diagnosed the threat properly. We didn't realize what massive impacts this was having on the flow of information, electoral impacts, political impacts. I mean, we're seeing the manifestation of this with the Hunter Biden laptop cover-up and the suppression and breaking links in direct messages of Twitter, and the fact that the Media Research Center has now come out with studies saying 1 in 6 Biden voters would have changed their vote had they been aware of that particular information that was actively suppressed by these tech companies. And the media as well. So I think it's very important to understand that what big tech does has political implications, but it also has moral and cultural implications. We're seeing that with some of the effects on young girls, with TikTok, with Instagram. Facebook knows what deleterious effects that its platforms have on the youth, and yet they're going full steam ahead with trying to make it easier for young people to access these platforms. Instagram just paused its under 13 platform that it still thinks is a good idea. They want to sort of let the press die down, let some of that negative Wall Street Journal publications, let that impact dissipate. So I think it's very important for conservatives to understand the problem. I think we're finally there. So when they next pull up these CEOs in front of them, I think their staff is doing a better job of understanding the technology,
right?
Understanding, what specific technical details matter to making policy, because before, Mark Zuckerberg, Sundar Pichai, these guys are running circles around these legislators because look at the age, there's not great tech savviness. But what encourages me is there's a cohort of young Republicans, people who are tech-minded. I don't want to name names, but I think there are great people coming out of Arizona, people who understand the technology, who are steeped in this, have a greater facility with it, and are going to be able to ask better questions and hold them to account. Because right now, what we're looking at is toothless. And I think it's problematic, hence the reason why the Heritage Foundation is coming out strong. We're saying with these executives, if they engage in legitimate instances of fraud, they should be held civilly liable. Redress that imbalance between the user, the people, and these massive oligopolies that are filled with centralized and concentrated power and are visiting that power that against the American people that that doesn't redound to the benefit of conservatives. So that's one slice of it. In terms of the top three things, if you want to get into that, we can get into that further, but I guess I'll stop there because I've been on a soapbox for 2 seconds.
No, it's fine. Honestly, it's refreshing to hear someone in the conservative movement that can speak about this stuff intelligently. I mean, I hate to say it, but that's just, it's just true. You see the impact that big tech plays on, you're right. I mean, everything from culture to religion to election integrity. And I'm like, good God Almighty. I mean, these people are able to move votes, able to move world views, if you will, and we absolutely do nothing about it. And I know there is an issue, just as you mentioned, there's an issue with Republicans and or conservatives, even libertarians. But when it comes to the issue of breaking up these companies, but I want to get your take on this because I never thought I would say this, Kara, but I'm like, hey, break these bad boys up. There's such a monopoly. They have so much power and influence, even more so than the federal government. I'm singing a tune that I never thought I'd be singing.
I think we all are, but we're meeting the moment, and that's what's important. I don't think that we should hew to these brittle ideologies that we've concocted for ourselves and saying, it's dogma masquerading as principle, really. And that's definitely more on the libertarian side, but it's time to understand and approach these problems with clear eyes and understand what is actually going on. That's the problem. If we just say, we're of the conservative mind, we don't touch private companies, and yet the left is setting the world on fire, and these private companies are wielding their power against us in massive ways that we're all watching unfold in concrete ways before our eyes. And I point people to, look at Bill Barr, right? Nobody can say he's not a conservative. And if you look at the big tech chapter of his new book, it reads like a summary of our heritage paper, right? It reads like, I mean, he probably wrote it before, so I'm not saying that he copied us, but he's a huge conservative. He's always been a stalwart conservative and, a very establishment conservative, not even of the new right. And yet he's saying, absolutely, antitrust needs to be looked at very seriously. We need to understand that these companies are concentrating their power and consolidating it in a way that is antithetical to self-governance. And a huge thing that I think is really important that people need to understand is our rights come from God, right? Our rights come from our Creator. This is enshrined in our founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. And one of those rights, freedom of speech, it's the First Amendment for a reason. It really matters. It can be infringed upon by a private entity as well. So when, we are, again, a self-governing republic, and when those rights are being infringed upon, whether by the government, whether by tech companies in league with the government, our antenna as conservatives need to go up, because these are values that precede don't touch the private companies values of, the 80s and 90s. I think we need to get back to what our country was founded on and, why we have the success that we've had and why these companies honestly are incorporated in America and have thrived and flourished under a uniquely American system because of those founding principles. And in my mind, what I want to see tech companies do is use something like the First Amendment as a guiding principle. We know that the Constitution says, the government cannot infringe upon freedom of speech, but when tech companies work, especially hand in glove with the government, to infringe upon freedom of speech, we have a problem. When tech companies eschew the First Amendment as a guiding principle, we have a problem. It's time to get back to that. This is what Heritage is saying. There's nothing more conservative than that.
Man, that's music to my ears. I could almost let you preach for the entire podcast. That was good. That was good stuff. But no, I really appreciate that. I mean, the Bill of Rights, obviously, those are given to us by God, and I do think we have to protect those, and they supersede. You're right. They supersede big tech, and quite frankly, they supersede the Constitution. I mean, our God-given rights are extremely important. You talked about antitrust. I want to get into some of the details and the nitty-gritty of this. Talk to us about antitrust, what it is exactly. I mean, I know what it is, but I want the audience to be informed on this. And then talk to us about Section 230. A lot of people have been talking to us or mentioning the Section 230. I forget how to phrase it, honestly. But basically liability, I believe. Will you talk to us about that? Is that significant? Will that help us if we adjust Section 230? I'm not even sure if I'm asking the question right, but I know you'll know what I'm talking about. So.
Yep. So these are the two things that most people have seized upon when it comes to doing something immediately about big tech. And one thing that I think has been mischaracterized by a lot of critics of, say, antitrust reform or the modernization of antitrust laws is they're saying, oh, this is crazy heavy regulation. You just want to regulate big businesses and not let them succeed and whatnot. You want to be a catspaw to Lena Khan, who's the chair of the Federal Trade Commission, or a catspaw to Elizabeth Warren. Completely false, completely wrong. Antitrust is law enforcement. We have existing antitrust laws that, and even as Bill Barr, again, attested to in his book, has not been enforced. And the enforcement mechanisms are the FTC and the antitrust division of the DOJ. And thus far, they've been asleep at the wheel while these big tech companies use something like Section 230, which is a statute of the Communications Decency Act of 1996, to allow themselves to have immunity from civil liability from what is posted on their platforms or what they remove from their platforms. So we'll bucket antitrust and we'll say, as you know, the Heritage Foundation, we think that you need to enforce existing antitrust law. You need to, if these companies are actually engaging in anti-competitive and predatory practices, let's enforce the law against them. As my friend Rachel Bovard always says, you know, conservatives, we're the party of law enforcement. Why are we not enforcing the law? So let's enforce the law. Where the law is deficient, I think you can modernize it. I think you can reform it. A good example of this is a proposal coming out of the House where most of these antitrust cases are tried in Northern California. You know, courts that are going to be more friendly to these big tech companies. Well, let's make sure that if, say, the Texas Attorney General brings a lawsuit against Google, which he's done 3 times, they should be able to be tried in different venues than necessarily that home base.
That's a good idea.
Companies. So that's an example of, yep, exactly. You modernize the law. And I tell people this all the time, especially having worked at Facebook, where our ethos was ship, ask questions later. So that means create the product, put it out in the world, then worry about the consequences later. Ask questions later. Technology always outpaces attempts to govern it. And these tech companies know it. So we need to give ourselves mechanisms to help that outdated nature of legislation and continue to govern technology. So modernize the law. That to me is very simple. It makes sense. And it's not something that is placing a legitimate regulatory burden on these companies.
Do you think
now legislation?
Oh, go ahead.
So yeah, we need to remember that these big tech companies are artifacts of federal legislation. And the premier example of this is Section 230, again, of the Communications Decency Act 1996. So this law, like I said, gives tech companies immunity from civil liability from what they host on their platforms and then what they remove in good faith on their platforms. They've taken a clause in the statute which says they're allowed to remove otherwise objectionable content, and they've taken that and they've run with it, right? You said yourself, you've fallen victim to this. I know many people, the Heritage Foundation has fallen victim to this removal of content that is conservative in nature or even heterodox in nature, anything that goes against whatever the prevailing leftist narrative of the day is. And tech companies are not allowed to be sued civilly in civil court because of if they remove that content. So that's Section 230. It protects them. And yes, I do think it was probably created for a noble purpose. You know, it allowed these companies to grow and thrive without the specter of litigation hanging over their heads and strangling them in the crib. So, okay, you know, good thought initially, but now we've seen how it's metastasized and it's really provided cover for these companies to do all of the content moderation, the censorship against conservatives and people who have different opinions, wrong-think into sort of perpetuity at this point. So let's reform it, let's focus it, let's make sure we strike that otherwise objectionable clause, and let's also hold tech companies accountable for political discrimination. So they shouldn't be given this civil immunity if they discriminate politically against conservatives or conservative content on their platform.
All right, speaking of speaking of antitrust, I love what many conservatives are doing. We're finally saying, hey, all right, let's go out and let's build our own. Let's get all of these, you've seen Getter. I mean, President Trump, former President Trump, has just come out with Truth Social. But I look at these and I'm so thankful that it's occurring. But I don't think it is a solution in and of itself, because as long as these companies exist, I mean, they're light years ahead of all of these conservative tech companies that I'm glad are starting up, and I'm getting on some of these new platforms. But at the same token, I think I'm being realistic, Kara, and you can check me if I'm wrong. But I'm like, we're not going to be able to match a Twitter. We're not going to be able to match a Facebook unless there's some fairness in the market, which goes back to antitrust law and Section 230. Am I wrong on that?
You're completely right, and that's a much more astute observation than even most libertarians can make, because the lazy argument that they always cleave to is, oh, well, there's other options, so why are you complaining? There's other options, what are you thinking? And then I always say, look at Parler. What happened when we created Parler, right? And so when it was sitting atop the App Store for Apple, wiped it off its platform. Google Play, same thing in those early days in January, and then Amazon Web Services, AWS, when they lights out, they pulled their cloud hosting services from Parler, it ceased to exist as it was originally conceived. And it's back, but only under very firm strictures, and it hasn't even gotten 4% of the growth that it was experiencing in those early days of January in 2021. So that's one thing. The second thing is people don't necessarily understand that the new alternative platforms that are being created, they are having to go up against these anti-competitive, predatory practices by these big tech companies in ways that, we don't even think about. There's a thing called Sherlocking, which, again, one of my colleagues, Joel Thayer, talks about, where these big tech companies steal the core functions of third-party apps that they are working with, and they take 30% commission in some instances.
Whoa.
They ask for shares, or basically require shares at way below market price. So there's a litany of ways that these companies are really engaging in these anti-competitive practices. Self-preferencing is a big one as well when it comes to some of the YouTube competitors and Google. So we need to think about that as well. And the third thing I'll say is that when Section 230 was created in the 90s, there are a degree of technical advantages that they've been able to accrue to make them the better products that they are today. And I would even argue, look at Google search these days.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that's necessarily a great product. It's serving you what they want to see, not necessarily the best information. It's not democratizing information as it once promised. So they were basically able to take a high volume and variety of data over the years and allow it to refine their algorithms to enhance their product. So there's a technical element, including network effects too. You want to be where all your friends are, right? That these tech companies, that's their advantage. So all of those three things taken together, I think, make you exactly right. We have a lot of catching up to do, but let's make sure we think about those anti-competitive practices, and we can redress them with the law. We can redress them with enforcement mechanisms, and I don't think that's an anti-conservative thing to do at all. We want to save the free market, right? We don't want to let it continue to be distorted and warped by these massive oligopolies.
Good Lord, Kara, if you run for office on this platform, you've got my vote. Good God. I mean, I really appreciate this information. I want to go to, let's pretend that we're in the middle of a congressional session, if you will, perhaps in front of a committee. What do Republicans on the Hill need to do specifically? We talked about Section 230, we talked about antitrust, but even when they're grilling these CEOs, I know that the select committees, like they've just made up this January 6th select committees have much more power. Do Republicans need to do that? What do they need to do on the Hill to make sure that these big tech companies are no longer ruling us, but we're ruling over them as we the people, if you will?
Yeah, that's a great question. And Rachel Bovard, again, came out with a great article about this in the Federalist. So she puts the details in terms of a select committee there. I've talked with a couple of my colleagues to members individually on the Hill, and we're telling them, you need to subpoena these guys at times. I go back to an early success story. We put this, I think I referred to it earlier, but we put this in our Heritage Foundation report where we say, let these tech executives, let these leaders be held civilly liable if they engage in legitimate instances of fraud or breach of contract. And I point to this early success story where Gofundme, do you remember with the trucker convoy in Canada, when Gofundme said, and they're an American company, but they were pressured by the Canadian government, the leftist Canadian government, to not dispense all of these funds that were raised for the trucker convoy to the people who wanted to give them the money. So what happened was when state attorneys general in the United States started saying to GoFundMe, oh, you're not going to give this money to the truckers that is rightfully theirs based off of the contract that you had with the users. You're not going to do that? Okay, we're going to sue you for fraud. And all of a sudden, GoFundMe, they said, okay, we're not going to give this money to these charities that we were saying we were going to give it to instead, which is right? Insane. And instead, we'll just give it back to you. So if you start saying fraud and you hang that sword over these leadership's heads, then I think they're going to sort of, that's going to shape their behavior in a way that is better. That is exactly, what they said that they would do when they created their company. So that's one way. So legislators, what is Congress's job? What is the job on the Hill? They have oversight, they have investigation abilities, and they make laws. So you can do all three. You should exert pressure on these companies, conduct oversight, investigate them if needed. I think there's a way to prohibit government use of tech companies to censor and chill speech. I think that's first and foremost, right? Because look at what Jen Psaki did. In July, she goes up to the podium and she says, we're working with Facebook. This is the press secretary for Joe Biden at the White House. And she goes up to the podium and says, we're working with Facebook to purge specific accounts that purvey disinformation off of their platform. Surgeon General follows up, says the same thing. Within a month, those 12 accounts and users were purged from Facebook. CNN bragged about this even in an article. DHS Secretary Mayorkas did the same thing, said, we're working with tech companies to ensure that they are used legitimately. We know what that means, right? Especially when DHS later releases that February 7th bulletin on terrorism and says, if you spread COVID misinformation, disinformation, or malinformation on social media, you could potentially be considered a terrorist. So when these tech companies work hand in glove with the government to chill speech, that should be prohibited in Congress. So I think Congress can write a law saying that this is not allowed and have reporting requirements for tech companies. Did this happen? What were your communications like? What were they about? What's the content of these communications in ways that are, have carve-outs for actual legitimate terrorism, not just what we're saying is terrorism now, because we're saying everything is terrorism that is remotely right of the left at all. So I think that's important. We can scrutinize these big tech business models. Look at the ad tech model. That is really visited and manipulated and exploited a lot of Americans. So that's another way to sort of get after this problem on the Hill.
Talk about that a little bit, if you would, Kara. I'm glad you mentioned that. I wanted to go into that, but I'm glad you mentioned that. So please go there with us, if you will. Their ad tech model.
So the backbone of a lot of these tech companies, the beating heart, is really how they get information from you and sell it to third party for ads. So there's the infamous Hill exchange with Mark Zuckerberg where, he's trying to, I think it was a senator, I'm not quite sure, but a representative, somebody asked, about how they make their money and whatnot. And Mark Zuckerberg's like, we sell ads, sir. So that's how Facebook, that's how Google, that's how they make their money. And oftentimes they have this sort of thing called, and there are much better, more scholars on this who've written at length about this, about how the buy side is connected to the sell side. So there's sort of a self-preferencing angle there. But when it comes to ad tech in general, it basically means that you, the user, your digital profile is being exploited by these big tech companies to sell to people who then offer you advertisements. And there's different ways. I mean, we've all seen the fact that our Gmail is combed through and then they serve up ads later. What we actually buy is then later served to us and targeted. There's a micro-targeting element here where you take elements of that digital profile and then you serve tailored information to that user. So there's a big way of doing it, but this is how they make their money effectively. And tech companies know that this is something that is in the crosshairs of the Hill. Senator Mike Lee is coming out with an ad tech bill that frankly would effectively end Google's monopoly as we know it.
Man,
so very interesting there. Some of these tech companies, especially the new alternatives, are looking more at subscription models and influencer models because they're sort of saying, all right, this ad tech model, it's exploitative. People are targeting it in Washington, D.C., so maybe this is the new way to go. So that ad tech model, I think, is, it's pernicious. It exploits the user, and it's definitely in the crosshairs of our policymakers in D.C.
Okay, Kara, we only have you for a couple more minutes, and you have been a wealth of knowledge. Such a blessing, really, to have you on the program. This is something that this man-made climate change just gets to me like no one's business, because I see how the left, how they use these issues in order to beat conservatives over the head, and they always seem to win. There's a couple of more things that I want to ask you. One, big tech has donated to campaigns before. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think that should be completely outlawed. And look at what Mark Zuckerberg was able to do in the elections of 2020, literally donating. I mean, in order to skirt the law, if you will, he donated to both Republicans and Democrats. But I think Democrats he was donating to like 20 times the amount, some ridiculous number. So that's one thing. And then I want you to just quickly talk to us about how the impact that social media has. Essentially, I don't think you framed it as this in the video of you that I watched, but essentially your ESG score, how it impacts your banking and all of these other avenues that we never consider, that conservatives must consider. And this is why we must defeat big tech totalitarianism.
Exactly. So this is why it's not just, tech, when people talk about antitrust and Section 230 and the free market, they're sort of bucketing big tech and the problems with big tech in the economic lens. And they're looking through it as, just a market issue, which I think, number one, they're getting wrong anyway. But number two, this is a political, as you say, a political and electoral problem. So when Mark Zuckerberg, in his own name, takes over $400 million through an NGO and lets them disseminate it inordinately in blue states and in swing districts, effectively, I would say, changing or influencing the election. This is a problem, and it does stem from big tech, even if it is, through Facebook, through Mark Zuckerberg, through NGO. So we need to just keep your eyes open, people. Like, at this point, he's able to do this on a technicality, and as you said, I think everyone with a brain cell knows that this is wrong, that is big tech money, that Mark Zuckerberg would not be as rich as he is without Facebook, without the artifact of federal legislation, Section 230, that government enhanced power as well. So that's something to think about and something to contend with in a way that is outside of just the purely economic lens. It has political impacts. And furthermore, there's another study that I didn't cite that I think matters too, where it said McLaughlin Associates, 52% of the American people thought that what Twitter and Facebook did, social media platforms, when it came to the Hunter Biden laptop, they thought it constituted election interference. I want to see a poll like that given Mark Zuckerberg's over $400 million. We've already seen it in Wisconsin, right, where they said this is illegal what he did. A judge said that. So, okay, good. We're on the right track. So that's one thing. I think the second issue is the ESG scores that you talked about, environmental, social, corporate governance scores. So what this means is, and I sort of link it to, I used to study the CCP's, the Chinese Communist Party's social credit system.
Wow.
And
okay.
my policy sort of career after Facebook was looking at the centralization of technology
Wow.
and power and technology, and how it in China, how they
Fascinating.
export it, what they do. And I'm just seeing the contours of this happening in the West. We saw it with Canada, right? You lose your livelihood if you have a wrong opinion. You lose your ability to bank. You lose your ability to contribute to online fundraisers. People ferret you out and dox you. And it's not just sort of a ground up movement like some of the left would have you believe. Oh, these people are doing bad things and they're being held accountable. Not so. This is a top down thing. We're very careful to call this totalitarianism in our heritage paper, because this is the government working with tech companies to get their way. Leftist governments, of course. So when it comes to everything is digitized, right? That means you're able to be controlled much easier. I saw a really interesting thing when it came to everybody buy electric cars, right? Okay, our ability to sort of shut down your electric cars from a centralized source, something like that could potentially be coming. And what I've heard other people say, and this is, I think, really smart, is the slippery slope is undefeated. So we look at
That
things
is really
like,
good.
right? And you say, oh, this could never happen here. But in the tech world, we also say, if you build it, they will come. If you make a tool, it's going to be misappropriated. If you create a technical capability, it's going to be misappropriated, especially when something like the Biden administration starts to get involved. And we've seen that they're very willing to clamp down on the populace. They're very willing to say, no, people of America, you don't get to make your own decisions. We know what's best for you. And that's an ethos that pervades the Biden administration and these big tech companies. And we've seen it with COVID. No more so than everybody's too dumb to make their own decisions on masks. So we'll tell everyone they have to wear a mask. And
Right.
then Fauci in private says, masks don't matter. They don't help at all. And now we're admitting the efficacy of cloth masks do very little, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's very important for Americans to understand that this is not just restricted to speech and social media. It can affect your email delivery services, your online banking, your online fundraising platforms, your ability to basically earn a living, your livelihood. When you donate to a Kyle Rittenhouse fund to the tune of $20, you lose your job. So it's very clear where this is heading, and Americans need to be very aware of this melding of the state with this digital consolidation of power and guard against it at all costs.
Holy moly. You know what, Kara, I just got to tell you this. I know someone that works in the tech industry, and this person is younger than me, and does everything old school, and tells me, like, if you knew how much information of your information is taken and used on a daily basis, you would go old school. And it was fascinating coming from this person that's in that particular industry. And so this person wants privacy, and the only way to achieve that was to go old school, pretty much, in this person's opinion, even though they were extremely tech savvy. And that alone, having the conversation with that person, scared the bejeebers out of me. So anyway, listen, guys, we are talking to Kara Frederick, who has been phenomenal from the Heritage Foundation. Kara, where can people go to find you and to get more information on big tech censorship, big tech totalitarianism? Where do they go to find you?
Yep, so heritage.org/big tech. That's where all of our work on big tech is going to reside, especially our big tech's totalitarianism paper. And then you can find me individually. I'm still on Twitter. We got to be on these platforms for now, at KaraFrederick. So Kara A. Frederick on Twitter. And yeah, thanks for having me. This has been great.
Yeah, absolutely. And we definitely have to get you back. I was expecting to have some of my questions answered, but honestly, you did that and then some. And I got to be honest, I'm just excited that people like you exist in the conservative movement, because you are needed more than ever. So God bless you for what you are doing. I truly, truly mean that.
Thanks, sir. It's mutual.
Thank you. All right. So again, please, guys, subscribe to the podcast. You can go to SalemPodcastNetwork.com. Subscribe there. Everywhere podcasts are found: Apple, Google, Spotify, YouTube. Make sure you click the bell. And Rumble. Again, you can check out my website, CarlJacksonShow.com. Find me on Facebook, Carl Jackson Radio, Twitter, and Parler at Carl Jackson Show. And please be sure to like and share the information, because as you've heard, the left is doing their best to stymie us, and we just can't let that happen. Kara, thank you so much for joining us today on the Carl Jackson Show podcast. It's been an absolute joy and a wealth of information. And I'm going to steal one of your lines: dogma masquerading as principle. I'm going to pretend like I made that up, Kara, but that was so phenomenal.
You have at it.
All right.
Yours.
All right. And I love the slippery slope is undefeated. That was cool too. All right. So anyway, thanks for joining us. Really appreciate you.